Hello and welcome to Vet Club. We're having a guest on our show today. Yes, so Bon Anderson, who is a second year, and I'm hoping I said that right. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
I was like, I should have clarified that before we started recording. Bon is joining us today from Glasgow, where you are a second year student at the University of Glasgow. And we're going to let you, share a little bit about what that means and how that might be different from folks that are studying in the US
Oh,
or
yeah, it's
elsewhere.
different over there.
It is, yeah. So welcome, Bon. We're so grateful that you're here.
Hi, yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I'm an avid listener, so I was so excited when
What?
Bobbi said she could have me on.
Yeah. So, as we often say, like if you have questions or things you'd like us to talk about on the show, send us an email, reach out, and we can either do a show or sometimes we'll have you come on the show, which is what we decided to do with Bon, partly because you had a fairly specific questions about studying and like how to study and how to do better and how and we've had a couple shows in the past, but you were like, I have some specific questions I want to
Yeah, I
follow
feel
up
like
on that.
most of our like studying stuff has been towards like the
We did a board exam
board
prep.
exam
Yeah,
stuff.
we did one about like just in vet school.
Yeah,
It's been
like
a
I think it
while.
was like how you approached vet school, which is very different now that it's like
That's
20
true too.
years later.
Hey. Uh, but and also because depending on the format, you're like, well, maybe that doesn't feel quite right for what I'm doing, and so you had some specific questions. So, Bon, I think what would be helpful is for you to start by just kind of sharing like what is vet school like for you. What's going on. Tell me, a little bit too, like how you ended up in Glasgow, and then what the format is, because it is quite different than I think we commonly see in the US. And I think it will be interesting for some of our listeners. Some of our listeners are going to be like, oh, cool, finally, they're talking about a format that I like, which will be great. But yeah, why don't you share with us what your current situation is?
Okay, so I'm at University of Glasgow. I applied here back in my sophomore year of undergrad, which is really wild to think about because University of Glasgow has a program which some UK schools do, where you basically study abroad for your first year or for your first year of grad school dash last year of undergrad. So I went to University of Maine and I did my first 3 years there, and then I was early acceptance to Glasgow, and I kind of just like wasn't really in attendance of my senior year of undergrad.
Mhm.
And then they sent my credits back to America to be counted for my completion of undergrad, which was really cool and definitely speeds it along because Glasgow is a 5 year program. So
Gotcha.
I'm still doing like the 8 years that most people do, but it was split up 3 and 5 instead of
Nice.
4 and 4. Yeah.
Nice.
And you don't need a residency, which is also really cool because the RCVS requires so much EMS, we call it, which is like internships. I
Mhm.
have 38 weeks of EMS as well as rotations. And so it's a lot of hands-on, and you start doing hands-on stuff in your very first year.
Oh, wow.
But
That's different.
the grading is completely different, it seems like. And I haven't attended American vet school, so I can't like totally speak to this.
Sure.
But basically, it's all exams for your grades,
Mhm.
but you have one multiple choice exam at the end of your first semester, and then you have another multiple choice exam at the end of your second semester, paired with a full year KIQ, which is a like short answer exam,
Mhm.
and then a full year practical exam, which is anything that you've seen in the lab, so like dissections, anything.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's like a board every year.
Kind of. Well, and I've
It's a
worked
lot.
with colleagues that have studied overseas in the UK, and yeah, they have described very similar, where it's just like, yep, just a handful of exams, and it's everything all together. And they come here and are like, there's so many exams, there's so many different ways to get assessed, which maybe it sometimes feels like a lot, like, oh my gosh, I only had to do exams a
Yeah.
couple times a year, but also like everything isn't writing on one exam. And so there's obviously pros and cons with both systems. But so you've been through it now a little bit, right? So
Mhm.
you've let us know like what have you already experienced and maybe what have you not yet experienced?
Right. So I've done all of the exams except for there's this thing called OSCEs, which I
Okay.
think American
Yeah.
universities
Yeah.
have, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Um,
schools use them. Yeah.
yeah, so we have those, but they're a separate grade than
Mhm.
our academic classes.
Yep.
So like they call it the elements of knowledge and application assessments. So that'll be like your KIQ, your multiple choice exams, all of those together. And it's also worth noting that the multiple choice exams together make up 30% of your grade. So each exam is only like 15%. Whereas the KIQ, which is the short answer one, is like 40% of your grade. I think it's
Huh.
45 total.
So you only have
Um,
one grade, like you don't have separate class
Yep.
grades.
no, no,
Okay,
because
that's
we
interesting.
also have
It makes sense.
modules.
Everybody's doing the same thing,
Yeah.
so why would you need a different grade for
Yeah.
each thing?
Yeah, well, and it's weird too because so we have modules, which I actually really like, where instead of having like five classes at once, you have one class every day for 3 weeks, and then you have like a review week, and then you go on to another class every day for 3 weeks.
Like block scheduling. Yeah.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. I like that a lot. It's just a lot for the exams. And so I've seen all the different types of exams because I did my last year and I passed all of them. But as I was talking with you guys about, I just think that I could do better. Like I've passed all my exams, but I was under average for pretty much everything, which is definitely, I know that a lot of vet students, I feel like, get kind of humbled when they come out of undergrad
Yeah.
because it's so much more content.
Yeah.
And I just feel like I could be studying more efficiently than I am because I'm studying a lot to just be getting by.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a couple things. Yeah, there are some differences in talking about like the one grade and how different it is from the US systems. I had a colleague years ago who would talk about, he was pretty sure the only reason he ended up getting like an internship in the US was because the people who were reviewing things just didn't understand the system. Because he's like,
Oh yeah.
I didn't actually do that well. Like my grades for like where I was were not very good. But I think in here, the US system, they're like, we don't know what that means. That seems pretty good. And so sometimes you can take advantage of that ignorance when people don't know
Yeah.
the
But
system.
at the end of the
But
day, if you
also,
graduate, you graduated.
I think that's the other.
Yeah.
There is also that mindset that's a little bit different, right? Rather than everybody needing to get an A, it's pass fail, right? Like, did you meet the minimum criteria? And so I'm wondering, if any of this bond do you think is because you're like, no, I had to work so hard to get where I was and to get in, and to everything's always competitive, and so I'm like, I want to be at the top. If that's it, if it's that, or if you're like, but I also don't, how do you feel like you're retaining the material? Do you feel like you're understanding the material pretty well? Or you're like, no, I'm learning it for the exam, but then forgetting a lot of it? What's your thoughts
Yeah.
there?
I think it's tough because so we have this thing called spiral curriculum, which is
Mhm.
like a very Glasgow thing. They love to hype it up.
Yeah.
If you're looking at going to University of Glasgow, you will hear this key phrase so many
Okay.
times.
A lot of people are doing
But
that, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. But we our first 2 years, they teach us like all of the basic foundation classes,
Mhm.
and then they double back for your next 2 years and
You
they
can
go
hopefully build
deeper
on it from
in.
there. Yeah. Yeah.
hmm
Good.
So it's tough because I'm in my second year, so I haven't really doubled back yet much.
Mhm. So to
Um,
know how that self check of what you know.
Yeah. Sometimes
and because
you find out like you didn't do as well in the first exams, but you understand the stuff.
Yeah.
And people aced it, but they just memorized it. Like they're very
Yeah.
good at rote stuff. And then you go back and they have to rote memorize everything again.
Yeah.
Whereas you may have like, oh yeah, I remember how that worked.
Yeah. So we'll get into that. We'll try to figure out which path you're on right now.
yeah, yeah. Well, and then I feel like another part is I haven't had that many exams,
Right.
like in total. When you think about it, I've only been tested on each semester once
Right.
when it was just like a semester thing. And there's only so many questions they can ask when they only give
Mhm.
you X number of exams. So it's tough to
Yeah.
How many
know what I
questions are
know.
on your exams?
So there's 60 multiple choice questions per multiple choice exam. And then it varies for the short answer ones.
Sure.
You have like eight-ish questions that like have little mini sub questions off of them.
Mhm. Are they like
But yeah.
scenario questions or are they just straight fact questions?
They love telling you a story for the short answer one. Like it'll be like you go to a farm on EMS and you meet this cow and it looks like this.
Okay, so they're
Yeah.
more
Uh,
scenario
Scenario
type
based.
questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So from a standpoint of like a reasonable exam length, 60 questions sounds good. But when I'm thinking about an entire semester's worth of
Yeah.
material, I'm like, what? There's so much stuff that you're not getting tested on, which is I think what you were kind of implying. You're like, I don't know what I don't know yet because I studied all this stuff, but I haven't been tested on
Yeah.
everything. And you've only done it once and you haven't had a chance to circle back yet.
I don't know if I told this story on the podcast where I probably have, but I did physics for undergrad and I have an electromagnetism professor. She gets in and someone asks like, oh, what's going to be on the exam? And she's like, I don't understand your question. And then she came in the next day. She's like, I thought about your question. And I think I understand now. And she went through and listed every section of every chapter that we had gone over so far.
Chapter 1.
And it was great because everybody starts writing down. It's like, what do I need to know? Because it's for those exams, it's only 3 questions.
Yeah.
Like you can't ask more than that and expect people to solve it in an hour. And so everybody starts writing down what it is. And then they realize she's naming just, every section of every chapter.
This is what you have to know.
It is like that sometimes. Like, oh, what if that's the one thing I don't know?
Yeah. I don't know if you've shared that story on the podcast
with,
before,
like,
but I've heard of
that stuff because it's like, oh, I don't know the ankle bone of a horse, what it's called, but
yeah, there's a lot of things.
So specific.
There is a lot of content, and so yeah, it's going to be tricky. And it's because vet school, there's a lot of material, right? There's a lot to learn, not just because there's multiple species, because, hopefully there's, good comparison and you're not having to like learn brand new information for each one, but like, okay, how do I tweak this between a dog and a cat and a horse and a guinea pig? And, but it is still, even if you just had one species, it's a so much volume of material, that not only, is kind of, we've mentioned before, Topher, is like, is it just, are you memorizing it or do you really want to understand it? And in those first couple of years when you're learning the foundational stuff, frankly, like a lot of it is memorization.
Yeah.
Because you sort of need to learn a new language.
All of anatomy. Like, were you an animal sciences undergrad? Or are you?
Yeah. I was pre-vet in animal sciences.
So that helps a little bit because you're familiar. But some people, I think, get in there and like they haven't done any of it. They've had the medical terminology class.
Yep, that's what I'd had. I'd had medical terminology, which really didn't teach me anything.
So like, what is the nerve ganglion?
I had learned none of that.
Thing of blah blah blah.
I had never had an anatomy class
like,
before.
what is this?
Yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot, but it is a lot of memorization because you can't yet make those connections because you need to have some of that knowledge before. And like, if I start, rattling off a sentence and it's a bunch of words you've never heard of, it's not going to mean anything to you. So you have to sort of learn the language, which is what it feels like the first couple of years of vet school is just learning the language and what those things mean.
Yeah. I sat on one of your lectures yesterday and it was just like, fancy word, 3 letters, 3 letters, 3 letters.
And he says all that all the time. I'm like, none of those words were very fancy.
And it's kind of like by the end, I knew what was going on, but all the students, like, she says, like, what is it? APT? I was like, is that new Rose song or something?
AST and ALT and ALP and G.
Yeah, and they all sound exactly like
they're all the
most
same.
of the students seem to know what's going on.
They knew.
But if you come in not knowing that language yet, then it's jargon and it makes
it is jargon. Yeah. It's one of the things that I actually remind, like when I have 3rd and 4th year students who are in clinics and are feeling like, I don't know anything. And they start kind of panicking that they don't have enough. I go back and talk to a first year, right? Go back and talk to somebody who hasn't yet learned the language. And I'm pretty sure I've shared this story on the podcast before, but like when I was a 4th year student, and I was on my equine medicine rotation, and that's not like my jam. And so but they had like a group that would come by at lunch for like a lunch and learn, and they would come down to the barn and they'd walk by and then you could learn about cases that are actually in the hospital. So you could kind of feel like there's a point to all this. And so I happened to be there. It was a case of mine. And this group comes by, it's like a little tour. And it's mostly 1st and 2nd year students. And they're like, hey, can you tell us about this case? And I'm like, oh yeah. And so I'm like starting with signalment and, it's like a gelding or blah, blah, blah. And it's got azotemia. And like some brave student in the back raises their hand, like, what's azotemia? And I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. I didn't know what that was when I was a first year either. And I started to realize like how much I've learned and I take for granted. Like there's so much that I've learned just in to be able to communicate like efficiently. And I take it for granted. And I was like, man, maybe I've learned a lot more than I've given myself credit for. And it was a reminder of how far I'd come in that time. And like to give myself a little grace, like, oh, okay, maybe you it's okay that you don't know everything, but you have learned so much.
Yeah, I think that's a nice reminder. Happens. It's like it creeps, and I don't know how it is in Europe, but in like the universities we've been at, the classes and cohorts stay together. Like they don't mix with the other classes and discuss things. Yeah. So you don't realize that you've improved so much because it's like, oh, that person knows more than me, and they're going probably to continue to know more you just because they're better academically. But if you compare them their first year to you your 2nd or 3rd year, way more than them.
There's no competition.
It's kind of like being the weakest person in a gym. Like you go to the gym every day and every day I'm the weakest person and blah, blah, blah. But then you go to like Walmart and you can pick up something that no one else can pick up.
This is like literally me every day when we get past it.
Yeah, we go to our gym and everybody's just like this amazing
We
athlete
work with a bunch of
and they
ridiculous
just
people.
crush us at
And I'm
everything.
like, "Mwah."
And then I realized like, oh, no one in my office could do this.
Yeah. So yeah, you have to be kind of fair to yourself
Yeah.
and think
Yeah.
about that.
Sometimes it's okay to just have average
Yeah.
or
However,
slightly below average for incredible people.
yeah. And so, okay, that's the like fluff.
Yeah.
That's you're doing fine, right?
Yeah.
You're,
No, I love it. Thank you.
this is good. But that doesn't mean you can't say, but how can I be better? And I think what you are also implying in your question is, how can I be more efficient? Like I'm spending a ton of time.
Yeah.
If this is the amount of time I'm spending, I want to see better results. And so how can you take
What's the point of working so hard? I'm just going to get the same results.
Yeah. And so can you either work more efficiently? So maybe you're working less to get the same result, or you're working the same amount that you are now with better results. Either of those I think makes sense. And so I think if we talk about from here on out, like switch focus to like, okay, what are you doing? And then, we can try to dig in and see what do we think is working. And I'll pull in some of my like knowledge now of education, right? Like, I'm like 3/4 of the way through my ed psych masters. And so I'm not an expert by any means, but I'm getting there. And I do have a lot more knowledge about learning. And we'll see if we can't dig into that and find ways to fine tune what you're already doing to make you feel like that's time well spent.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the hype up too, because I definitely, I get in my head so much sometimes, and I try to be grateful that I'm just like in a position where I can learn so much too.
Yeah.
Because we invest so much money in our brains to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And some of them are still
not everyone can do
time.
that. So
Your time and your
what'd you say?
it's your time and your future that you're invested too. It's like,
Yes.
then
Yeah.
years here, and then this is what you're gonna do.
Yeah. And it's worth it, right? And it's not that. So, but yes, you can also like give yourself a break and give yourself some grace and be like, you're doing a hard thing and you're doing it well. And so that's okay. And not only that, you have the extra where you're like, but how can I be even better? Which is amazing that you have something left to be like, what can I do better? And so I'm like super proud of you for reaching out to say, how can I be a little bit better than what I'm doing now? Because what you're doing now is enough, right? It is, but we can always strive to figure out ways to be that much better. So with that, maybe I know you described some of this in your email to me, but maybe for our listeners, you could share what's your study technique? Like, what are you doing in general to prepare?
Okay, so I am world's slowest typer, which I feel like is actually good because I have never been one to take notes in class. I usually would they post our PowerPoints consistently 24 hours before every single class. So, which is great because I'll usually type out notes for those PowerPoints the day before, usually the morning before because I'm a morning person. For second year, all of our classes are in the afternoon, which is kind of brutal because it's like 2 to 5 p.m. I have 3 lectures in a row every day.
Okay.
But yeah, so say it was Monday morning, I would be preparing my notes for class Tuesday afternoon. And then on Tuesday morning, I'll be reviewing what happened on Monday afternoon and preparing my notes for Wednesday class.
Okay. Yep.
So I do that, and then every Sunday, I have a group of 5 friends, and we have all very different veterinary interests, which is really nice, and different like learning techniques.
Love that.
And there's a big study building on main campus because the vet campus is very removed from the actual University of Glasgow campus.
Okay.
But the main campus has a building, which is great because we get like out of the vet realm.
Yeah, that's
And
happen.
Love that.
yes, it's so nice. And they have a massive whiteboard and they have like projection screens that you can connect your computer to and stuff. So we'll usually draw out and we do like mind maps. So like we just did the coagulation cascade because we're in cardiology right now and they did coagulation cascade last year and they like briefly mentioned it and then it was the basis for the entire lecture and we were like, whoa, we don't even fully remember that from last year. Like
yeah.
So we drew that out. So we do things like that a lot. The one thing that I feel like study group could be more on top of, because we all have become really good friends now, it's really helpful that we all have different interests. So there's like a horse person, and then somebody else is very exotics oriented. But we are such friends now that I feel like we chat a lot and I don't know how to like stay on topic or if we should be like preparing something before we go to study group rather than just like I'll type in topics that I want to get to before Sunday. So like throughout the week, I have like a little sticky note that'll be like topics I want to look at, but I don't really have like questions to go over.
Hmm.
Um, and then the big thing I do other than that I'm doing just like constantly is I have Quizlet Plus. It is the best $30 I spend a year. And it gives me unlimited access to the Learn feature. So like when I make decks, I can like do the Learn feature unlimited. Because I kind of felt like if I was doing flashcards, I would just flip through them. Whereas with the Learn feature, you have to like type in every once in a while and like it
Can you
does
tell me
multiple
what that is?
choice
I don't know.
questions
I don't
too.
know what that is. I mean, I've heard of,
Okay,
but
yeah,
it's basically it's a way to help you make flashcards, right? Um,
yeah.
tell me what the learn feature is and how that's different.
So on Quizlet, you can do the flashcard feature, which is kind of like if you just flip the flashcards online.
Mhm.
Or they have Learn, which is where it gives like a multiple choice question.
Okay.
And then once you get that right enough times, it'll make you type it in without multiple choices.
Oh, okay. So there, yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, so
yeah.
you can't just
And
That's
you just go through the
scaffolding.
deck.
Oh, I love it. Okay.
Yeah.
Pretty good. That is a good feature. All right. That's based on scaffolding. Aha. Meaning you've got initially you just have to recognize it, right? And then again, they're saying, hey, you've seen this enough. You should be able to come up with this on your own because if you only ever just try to recognize it, you don't get that deeper learning. So that's a really great feature. Okay, this is good. I'm taking notes here because there are things you're saying that I want to address, but keep going.
And then the one thing I will note with Quizlet is I used to spend so long writing my own questions and I don't anymore because it just took too much time. And I don't know if I should go back to that because it's tough because like I said, we don't have that many quizzes. So like I wasn't there was too much time in between to be able to see if it like made that big of a difference between me
Sure.
typing it out. And Quizlet has this feature where you can upload the PowerPoints and its AI will just like spit out a Quizlet deck. So
Okay.
I don't know if it's worth it for me to like write my own and I'm like open to find out that it is. Like
Yeah.
if it's worth it, I will type my own questions.
Yeah.
But that's definitely a big question I have is if it's worth it to make your own questions
Mhm.
because it did take so much time.
Yeah.
And Quizlet will let you just like put in the PowerPoints and it'll spit out a whole deck for that PowerPoint, which is pretty cool.
Yes. Okay. There's a lot of good stuff in there. A lot of good stuff. Okay. So the first thing I wrote down, you mentioned you were a slow typer. And that's not necessarily that's fine. That it is what it is. And I don't even know if it's true compared to Topher. You're probably really fast, but
I'm a very fast typer.
so there is actually some really interesting research suggesting that when you handwrite instead of typing, you actually learn better. You remember things.
Okay, cool.
So that's if you're a slow typer now, if you can't read your writing later, right? You have to factor that in. If your writing is neat enough, that might be a tool that in some situations is actually better for you. So don't feel like you have to type things out. If the situation works where handwriting it might actually benefit you from a learning standpoint. So that's one thing to consider.
You gotta be careful with handwriting. I found
That's
that
the
out in
problem.
undergrad.
That's the problem.
I'd never written anything down from lecture. I like to pay attention during the lecture, and they didn't have lecture capture back when
Yeah.
I was in school, so I couldn't go back and watch it again.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where it's like they're saying stuff that's not in the books, so I have to write it down. And I first started writing down with a pencil,
Oh yeah, that was dumb.
and then
So old.
yeah, I looked at my notes the next day, and they'd all smudged together,
Yeah.
so you couldn't read it. So I was like, oh, I have to write everything down in
Pretty
pen.
sure if she's writing, she's gonna write on a tablet with like
Yeah.
it's still gonna be electronic. It's okay.
Yeah.
But again, the handwriting it rather than typing it, there is something about our brains that we remember things better. So you do have to contend with: is it legible? Is it going to erase if you rub it together or smudge? Like, yeah, if you're writing in pen in the rain, maybe that's not the best system. But thinking about those kinds of things. So just that was one little thing I wanted to mention.
Do colors matter? Sorry, not to interrupt, but do colors matter when you're doing notes? Like,
Probably
does it
not.
help you more? Okay.
I think that would just be a confused, like you'd lose time switching pens.
If again, like if you come up with a system that everybody's different, right? So if you come up with a system that works for you, I'm not going to say no, don't do that. But if it's extra time and effort, I'm not aware of any evidence that switching colors or any of that is going to benefit you.
If you rewrite your note, I know a lot of people who rewrite their notes, and that would be a time like you could switch color and it kind of cements like
Except don't rewrite your notes.
Don't know.
No. If you no, don't rewrite your notes. Asterisk. Okay, let me clarify that. Okay, if what you're doing is recopying your notes, don't do that. If you're taking the notes that you'd written before and reorganizing them and paraphrasing them
Oh yeah,
and
that's what I meant.
processing them,
Yeah.
yes, then you can do that. And if at that point you want to incorporate different colors because it's color coded or something like that, yes. But if you're just recopying to make it neater or to, you need to actually be changing it in some way using information like, hey, does it make sense the way I wrote it? That I'm going to write it this way because that makes more sense. That would be valuable time spent. But if you're genuinely just rewriting or recopying your notes, that's a waste of time. Well, I shouldn't say that.
For most people.
That is not an efficient use of study time if you want to learn it long term. And
Okay.
that's one thing that I think is really important here, Bon, because you're talking about learning for the whole semester for a test at the end of the semester. So it's just not possible for you to cram, right? Cramming is not an option
No.
for you. There's too much volume. So everything you do has to be about how do I make this stick in my long-term memory? And there's a term in educational psychology that is like every time anybody studies this, it pretty much works that you need to use what's called retrieval practice. It's called the testing effect or the retrieval practice effect. So every time you take a test or a quiz or some sort of test, you have to pull that information from your memory rather than just rereading it from your notes. That's a more active
Right.
process than passively reading your notes. But there's lots of different ways that you can use retrieval practice that doesn't have to be a test per se. And so that's where I'm like, rewriting your notes is sort of passive, like recopying them. You're not actually pulling anything from memory. And your brain can be kind of lazy or it's striving to be efficient, whichever way you want to look at it. But if something's written down and you just have to copy it over, it's like, well, I don't need to memorize that because it's written right there and I'll just have that next time, right? That's a resource that's available to me. Versus if you see it and then you turn away and you go, okay, what did that say? Try to remember it. And your brain's like, oh, that's something you want me to know. Oh, okay. And it will put more effort into trying to commit something to memory. So, a couple things that you talked about, preparing your notes. Monday morning, you're going to prepare for Monday afternoon's lessons. That's good. There's a phenomenon called priming. And so like just, getting started and getting your head thinking about the kinds of concepts that you're going to talk about that day is important. It will make the process for where to put things in your brain a little bit more efficient, which is really good. I think the reviewing and preparing is also good, like the next day, depending a little bit on how you review. So this same concept is going to come up over and over and over again about not just rereading or reviewing or rewatching or whatever it happens to be. It's making sure your brain is engaged in creating the study material, right? And so you were asking about writing exam questions. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And you were talking about, is it worth the time putting into writing exam questions? And the answer is it very well could be. And I had an idea. I had an idea when you were describing your group of friends, your study group. And I'm wondering, you're getting together once a week. You've mentioned a few things, and I'm going to try to see if I can put all this together and come up with a solution that might address several things. So you're friends, which is great, and you're having a good time, and you need that. That's a good break for your brain. But you maybe sometimes aren't as on track as you could be, right? So you allow yourselves to get distracted. So there's also some good stuff about motivation, like goal setting goals for yourselves. I'm wondering if we could solve a bunch of problems with one. So if you think you could go back to your study group, and what if you said, okay, for Sunday, we are each going to bring, 5, 10, whatever, come up with a number of practice questions that you're each going to write. Okay. And you mentioned that you're like a diverse group of interests. And so you're all going to look at things a little bit differently, which is awesome. Maybe you assign this person's going to cover this topic. This person's going to cover whatever, however you decide to divide it up. So everybody's doing a little bit of work. In writing those questions, that is hard. It's really hard to write good questions that are challenging enough to be worthwhile, but make sense, are clear, right? That process in and of itself, like you have to understand the material pretty well to ask the question. But also when your friends have to answer the question, right? They have to do the work as well. So they're doing a form of retrieval practice. But now you're spreading the workload out. You're setting goals for each of yourselves, right? So hey, on Sunday we each we've decided this week everybody's going to have 10 questions, and they're all multiple choice questions, or maybe it's a mixture because depending on, you're preparing for both a multiple choice and like a free response test. So maybe you each write 3 multiple choice and 3 free response style questions just to make sure you've got a good diverse type of question. And then on Sunday, you're all going to take the test that you've all collectively created. You could probably even, if you wanted to supplement it, ask Quizlet to make some questions too. Throw some of those in there, right? Just to get another,
right.
You've got a 6th person or whatever. So now writing the questions is a form of practice, right? You're doing the work there, and you're getting more out of writing that question than you are having Quizlet write the question, right? But answering the question is also a form of retrieval practice. So that is still beneficial. And all of these things combined, it sort of reduces the workload. So you're not having to write all of the questions, but everybody else is participating in that. So that's one thing, like that's where my head went.
I have a question for that.
Okay.
How would it work? So let's say you just put all your like learning points into Quizlet and it generates you a bunch of questions. You run through that once or twice, and like you can identify the things that you're not getting and then write questions about that. So that way, like cuts the number. You're not writing a question about something that you understand.
Yeah. And that would be an option.
That cuts the time a little bit.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's good. So trying to use the technology to sort of supplement and make you more efficient, I think is smart, but focusing the attention on what are the areas that you are struggling in. You go, oh, okay, I'm struggling with this, so I have to do the work to write better questions there. I think that is it. You'll have to play around with it, right? And I do like that suggestion, Topher. I think that's good. And again, you might find that a couple of your friends are like, I'm not good at writing these questions. I don't like it, or this isn't beneficial for me, or it takes an inordinate amount of time for me to do it, and my time is better. Maybe you don't all have to necessarily do the exact same things. We had a system when I was in vet school where, again, I wrote practice questions because that was helpful for me, and other people did other things and they shared what they had done. And for me, writing the questions was really good practice. And then for my study group, taking my tests were helpful. Even though some of the questions were really bad, it still got us talking about the topics, right? They're like, well, that doesn't make sense because of this, Bobbi. And I was like, okay, sorry, but we're still learning it. So they don't have to be amazing questions. The process of going through it together as a group is also really helpful.
Yeah, they play to each other's strengths.
Yeah.
Like everybody has different methods for studying, and they can kind of like show you a little bit.
So yeah, I don't know. Do you think that's something your study group might be open to playing around with?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, they're getting the link to this.
You're like, oh, well, this is what they said we need to do. So again, you could try different things. And like Topher said, where does Quizlet get involved? Maybe to supplement the test, or maybe throughout the week when you're trying to figure out what questions to write, you go through some of theirs. Like, these are easy. These are easy. Okay, these are the hard ones. That's where I'm going to spend my time. So you do want to strategize and focus on the things that are more challenging, for sure. The stuff that's easier to grasp. I mean, throw some of those in there too, because you need a little ego boost sometimes.
What about like, say you throw into like the AI thing and it makes you a massive test, like taking the test together, like looking at things, or it's like, oh, this doesn't quite make sense to me, and someone else will be like, oh yeah, it's blah 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 blah, and they have some weird way of remembering it that's now how you remember. Oh
yeah, sharing those mnemonic devices. Oh my gosh. So I'm gonna one of my classmates, when we were trying to remember the antibiotics that cross the blood-brain barrier, and she came up with this chugging down the runway of the skull. That doesn't mean anything. It's a useless phrase. I still remember it, and I still use it to this day. So Courtney Zorn, well done. Shout out to Courtney. She came up with that one day. She was like, oh, this is how I've been remembering it. And we giggled about it because it was like, it didn't make sense, but I remember it. And so I'm like, okay, chloramphenicol, doxycycline, TMS, rifampin, and what was the S? Oh no.
Oh, not a very good mnemonic.
Hang on.
I don't know if I have the buttons the same on this one.
Oh, you might not. No.
No, that was the Can you hear the buttons when I make them? I don't know if you can or not.
Nope.
I couldn't hear the music at the beginning when we were just like, I was bobbing my head like a weirdo.
I was staring at you guys waiting for someone to talk because I knew that it was probably playing.
Yeah.
But I could not hear it.
Before we started recording to mention that. At any rate. So yeah, sharing mnemonic devices or tricks that you use is absolutely helpful. When you said taking the test together, I think everybody should take the test by themselves and then go over it together. Because the problem with taking it together is you might have somebody like me in the group who is like, it's A, it's B, it's even if I'm wrong, right? Like I'm still probably going to be one of the first ones to speak up. And so somebody who is not as obnoxious might stay back and like just be more quiet. And then maybe they're not
Yeah, it's
engaging
not
in the same
valuable for
way.
their time.
So you don't want a more passive person to just sit and listen to others. So I think if you have that test and you all individually take it quietly, by yourselves in the first, whatever time that takes, and then together you go through the answer. So everybody has had to commit an answer, to the paper or whatever before you go. Even if they don't share their answers with them, they had to go through that in the test, and so that was still beneficial for them. So if somebody in the group who's like not going to speak up as much, that's okay because they've taken the test already. They've gotten that retrieval practice benefit, and then like you said though, people will share. They're like, oh well, I thought it was, especially because they're questions you've written yourselves. So you're not point grubbing, right? You're not going to the professor and being like, why didn't I get, but you are going to be like, I mean, my friends did the same thing. They were like, Bobbi, that doesn't make any sense. Both A, like A is, I thought A was the right answer. That's what I wrote on my test. And they're like, no, it's definitely C. And then we could discuss it, right? Oh, well, I thought, and they're like, oh, and sometimes I'm wrong and sometimes and sometimes we're both right. It just wasn't a very good question, but we still talked about the concepts. Some of them are simple recall. Do you remember, what the insertion point is for this muscle, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And those are helpful too, just because you need to practice those over time.
But also shows like what other people thought was important from the lectures.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you might sneeze and you miss something important that the professor's doing.
Or you were writing down the previous thing that was said, and so you missed what she said for the next one, but it was a flip-flop for your classmate. And so they caught the next thing that the professor said because they were writing down from the previous one, and you just kind of leapfrog over each other. And then you're all picking up on some things that you're like, yes.
Yeah, or like
really
the mannerisms.
Like she said this.
Like the professor does this, and somebody thinks like, oh, like you need to pay attention to that. Another person's like, oh, they're just rattling off facts that you don't really didn't know.
Oh, that reminds me of a question I had when you were talking about your studying. Do your professors provide you with learning objectives at the beginning of your lessons?
Yes. So they have ILOs. They have ILOs for the year, and then they have course ILOs. And they're supposed to be writing exam questions based off of that.
Yeah.
And I love Glasgow. There are too many ILOs.
Okay.
There are not enough exam questions to meet the number of ILOs we have for each year.
Right.
So it's tough because it's like some of these exam ILOs you can tell have to be on like the OSCEs. So they have to be on like a communication thing. They can't, they're not really like something you could write on a
to an MCQ, yeah.
But then it's like other ones, it's like, okay, well, there's 7 different ILOs that could be here. Or the ILO will be like, behave in a professional manner. And it's like, that is really important. Don't get me wrong.
It's not likely to be on the MCQ.
But that could be anything on the MCQ. So I guess my follow-up question would be, do you know if if you should be studying differently for a multiple choice exam versus a written answer exam, or is it about the same?
So this is a loaded question. So philosophically, no, because really your goals, while yes, you want to pass the multiple choice exam and you want to pass all your exams, and like that, those are important benchmarks that you have to meet, right, to succeed ultimately in the profession. I don't want people to be studying to a test, right? Like philosophically, that's not what I want. Now, when I'm writing my questions, I'm thinking about that, right? Like I want to write questions that are relevant and I want somebody to know and remember forever. But I also recognize that sometimes there's stupid questions on the exam that was just a random factoid that somebody thought needed to be asked for some reason. So I also understand, so I say that, I don't want you studying to pass a multiple choice question or a multiple choice test. That isn't what I want, but I also understand the reality of life and that sometimes you have to do that. So there's going to be two answers to this question. At the end of the day, no. Your studying shouldn't really make a difference. And then in your situation, that's mostly true because you have to remember it for the whole semester, right? So other than the material you get the last week, right? You cannot possibly take a semester's worth of material and cram it the 2 nights before. It's just not a thing that can be done.
And also you're passing.
And you're passing, yeah. So
at the end of the day, you're graduating.
Yeah. So at what I'd prefer you to focus on both for testing success and for your long-term career is what is the stuff that you're going to remember long-term. The difference between, how do you study isn't necessarily the format. as far as remembering the information. Having good test taking skills though, right? Like that is beneficial. And there's plenty of evidence to show like if you're generally good at multiple choice questions, you'll probably perform better, even if you don't know the content as well as somebody else who knows the content better, but isn't a good MCQ test taker. So having an opportunity throughout the year to practice taking MCQ tests does help prepare you for taking MCQ tests. And so that's where like the test question writing can be really helpful. The other thing is multiple choice questions, that style of question lends itself really much more easily to recall type questions, fact based. There is one answer and we all agree this is the one right answer. It is much more challenging to write analysis level questions like when you were describing like, yeah, you show up to a farm and you meet a cow, blah, blah, blah. Those aren't as often going to end up as a multiple choice question as when you can, write it out and tell me. They can happen. It's a lot harder. And so people tend to avoid it. It's harder to write good quality multiple choice questions that require you to apply knowledge or to analyze information. And then everybody who's writing that question can be like, yes, we agree. That is the one right answer. So when you're studying for multiple choice based exams, my thoughts are, do you need to focus more on the fact-based detail, right? Not so much applying the knowledge and like how, why is this important? Or how am I going to apply that to a clinical scenario versus memorize it, right? Like just do the flashcard over and over again until you remember it. And that might change in the first couple of years, right? Once you've gotten past that foundation, once you have the language, once you've learned what azotemia means and you've learned what hyperbilirubinemia is, then you can start to move into the more application style. But the earlier you do that, the better it is going to be, right? So learning for long-term retention is still going to help you, whether it's multiple choice or short answer. But I think the difference there really just comes down to test taking strategies. So if you want to prepare and to be more successful on a certain test, then study the format that in that same testing format. So your test taking skills also improve, but the content, how you retain the content, again, retrieval practice, using paraphrasing your notes. So not just recopying your notes, not rereading the material, but maybe instead of writing test questions, right? Somebody from your group comes in and is like, okay, I'm going to paraphrase. I have 2 minutes to summarize the 1 hour lesson we had on, the stifle, whatever, I don't know. And so that's the challenge is you only have 2 minutes to say all the important things. That processing to try to take all of that information and, bring it down to like, what is the most essential stuff? That takes work, right? That takes brain work, and that will help you remember the information. So any form of retrieval practice where you are taking information, remembering it from your brain, mixing it up, reprocessing it, and spitting it out in your own words is super valuable. So that could be writing test questions. That could be, again, paraphrasing, sharing with your study partners, your cat, whatever. But, putting it back in your own words, taking tests, practice tests. So the Quizlet is an excellent resource as well.
I have a question for you about the test. So how useful would it be it's like a 60 question multiple choice and then like a 10 question short answer.
Okay.
Over short, how much would it be beneficial to set up exactly as your final thing? Like sit down and take a 60 question multiple choice test in the allotted time just to kind of like go through the hoops.
I think that I don't know that there's any like specific studies on that. I think if you have testing anxiety, I think that's a good thing to do. Right? Like practice it in the environment that it's going to be. I think if there's time limits and you're worried about time management, doing that. So I think it depends on what your specific goals are.
And what your strengths and weaknesses are.
Exactly. So like, are you a fast test taker and you're not really worried about the time limit? Okay, then maybe you don't need to do that. But if you're like, hey, I always am running into the time limit on the exam. Yeah, practicing. But again, that's more about test taking skills. But practicing like, oh, I didn't even realize that I spent 5 minutes on that one MCQ, and I don't have 5 minutes to spend on one MCQ, right? So I think it can really help with some of those tactics that you can use to make you a better test taker. But as far as like learning the material, no, it's not going to be necessarily beneficial for that. It's more about like getting your head in the right environment for taking that test, I think.
I have a question for you too about the test. Like, what is a good score on an MCQ? Like, how many out of 60?
Oh gosh. Okay. So failing would be, and it's different too because it's not just like an F for failing here.
Uh,
It would be you have like scores under a fail. So
Hmm.
it goes all the way down to G, I think, but anything below D is a fail.
Hmm.
mhm.
Because also their D's are what we would call a C in the States,
Yeah.
which was definitely hard to wrap our brain around. But any for a 60 question multiple choice, a 30 would be the benchmark around there
Okay,
for
that's pretty good.
what would be
Yeah.
anything above a 30 is a D, anything below is
Yeah.
not. But again, like a D3 is like a C minus for
Yeah.
us.
Mhm.
Yeah. And there's only so many of those you can get. And are there opportunities to remediate if you know?
Um, so if you don't, basically they tally up all of your scores from your exams,
Hmm.
and if you don't pass in total, so you could fail one of the exam, you could fail 3 out of 4 of the exams, but if you did really well on that last one and you brought your score enough up that you passed the year, then you're fine.
You'd be okay.
If you didn't, you're allowed to resit all of the exams. So say even if you just
Okay.
failed by like 1 point total, like you failed by 1%, you
Mm.
have to resit all of the exams in the summer. And if you pass those, you're allowed to go on as normal. If you fail those, you have to resit the whole year.
Okay.
So it's definitely high stakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have no homework. I feel like I didn't mention that.
Hmm.
We don't actually have anything that's due otherwise, which is nice because it does make it a little bit easier for you to like manage your time as a
Yeah.
student. And all the lectures are available online, which is
Okay.
really unique, or not unique because I know a lot of schools are doing that, but like attendance isn't necessarily necessary if that's
Yeah.
not how you study.
Mhm.
But I know I really struggle to focus if I'm like, I always get upset whenever I'm sick because I like really struggle to look at the recorded
Okay.
lectures,
So you're
even
going
though they're
to
the
class.
exact same thing.
You're going to class.
What?
You are going to class.
Yeah, yeah.
That
I
was
go
going
to
to be
every
one.
class.
Yeah. Good.
I go to every class. I get like angry at my body when I'm sick because I really struggle to focus. I don't know if this is like science, but the only way that I can focus when I'm watching the recorded lectures, if I did get sick, I have like a little walking pad
Oh,
and
okay.
it's like enough
Yeah.
distraction for my brain to be
That's
walking
hilarious.
and like it forces me to be like in that spot. I can't be like running around the house doing a million things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I
great
have to be
cognitive
on the
skill.
pad.
That's hilarious. Love it. No,
But
I
yeah,
love
no,
that you're
I'm in
in
every
class.
class.
I think that's really good. I was the same. So I didn't get sick too much, which was good. This was again pre-COVID, so I probably went to class sick more than I should have. But um, I was the same way. Like if I missed a class for some reason, that material, I never really got it. I never, and they were not recorded. So I didn't
Yeah, I
have
was
the
gonna
opportunity to
say,
go
I
and watch
recorded
them
that thing
later. That
either.
wasn't an option. But even just like looking at my friend's notes and reading the material, it was just never the same. And so I say, attendance, my classes now is optional. But if I tell anybody, if you are struggling to get the material, you absolutely should attend in person because that is your first study session, right? You're processing what the professor is saying, and it's like a multimedia way. Like you're reading what's on the slides, you're hearing what they're saying, you're hearing those anecdotes and putting all that together, and
Yeah.
it's activating your brain, which is really important.
You also like you see what the your classmates are doing, and you kind of hear like the little things that they're saying, like what did the professor just say? And you look around, everybody else is confused too. It's like, oh, all right, this
Let's
isn't as
ask a
important.
question, but it's
Yeah.
also an opportunity to engage in the process. And so I think I don't know that I'm not aware of any specific literature that showing up in person is like cognitively makes a difference, but this is me just speculating here. I don't know. But I also know like we've all grown up with screens and television and this and that. And oftentimes that's a thing that's on in the background. It's so easy to get distracted. There is evidence. There's good evidence that like if you're sitting in a classroom and you have a screen up, you're not going to do as well as somebody who's sitting in a classroom who doesn't have a screen up, who doesn't have their phone up. You're also, if you're sitting in a class and you don't have a screen, but your neighbor does, you're not going to do as well as somebody who's sitting in a class, doesn't have a screen up, and the people around them don't have screens up because they're distractors, right? And we learn what we pay attention to. We learn what we focus on. We process what we pay attention to. And anything that can distract us deviates from that goal. And so going to class in person is absolutely beneficial. Going to class in person, putting your device away and writing on paper is probably going to be next level up, right? And that's really hard because right now, like the current generation of students, which I'm sure is true for you, Bon, is you show up and you've got your tablet, you've got your notes, you've got the slides. And I don't think those are bad things. But I think recognizing that we are human and we all get distracted by our phones, by, the person next to me is like shopping for shoes and you glance over and guess what? They distract, you're trying to be good, but your neighbor is shopping for shoes and you're curious about those boots they were looking at. Like, even if that distraction is like, oh, it's so annoying that they're shopping. They should be paying attention. Guess what? You're not paying attention right now because you're thinking about what they're doing. And so we're susceptible to it. Every one of us, none of us is immune. And so I think that's partly why you have a hard time watching the video later because you're just surrounded by it. It's a lot easier to distract. It just is.
It's more convenient.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
I can do that while I'm washing the dishes. I can do it while I'm exercising. But what? You're not focusing in the same way. And so that's where some supplementary things can be good. So if you go to class in person and then later while you're like doing the dishes or, whatever chores or exercising and you want to listen to or watch it then as a second pass, that makes sense. Like that's efficient. I have no problem with that. But that's not going to be nearly as effective or impactful as really engaging with material. That your brain knows the difference. And again, I can have a TV show on in the background. And if I watch it enough, if I watch a movie enough times, eventually I learn the lines, right? Not because I'm trying to learn the lines, but I will learn the lines to all the movies if I've seen them enough, even if that's not my goal. But if my job was to summarize this movie, right, instead of quote all the lines, I'm going to process things very differently. I'm going to go back and say, okay, what happened in there? I have to think about it for myself. I have to write up a summary of this movie. I'm going to remember it better than if I just have it on in the background. So you really just have to tell your brain, this is important. And the way your brain knows it's important is because you ask your brain to come up with it. If you want your brain to come up with it from scratch later, tell it now, that's what I need. That's really the essence of retrieval practice, is telling your brain, this is material I want you to be able to come up with on the spot. And so you practice it. That's the goal.
I guess
it goes with that.
To build on that, do you have any advice for just focusing in lectures? Because we have 3 lectures a day that are back to back.
Yeah.
They have a 10-minute break in between, but it's from 2 to 5 p.m. And I am such a morning person.
Yeah.
5 p.m., like my day is over.
Yeah.
And it's so tough. And it's getting better now that it's like light after 5. But especially in Glasgow, it gets dark.
Yeah.
It was getting dark at like 4 p.m.
That's
And
hard.
so like our whole last lecture was like they had to turn the lights on.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was just wondering, do you have any advice for like, that is a lot of time and it's funny because they have like all the study timers and like you shouldn't study for more than 30 minutes and then or for more than 90 minutes and then like
they're having you
for 3 hours.
Yeah. I don't know that I have anything particularly helpful. That honestly is more on the instructors, right? Like they should be, and it's hard to do, right? Because everything is based on you have an hour lecture, but they should be structuring the material such that you have breaks and you have things that are keeping your attention rather than just a straight lecture. Because as humans, we can't concentrate on a lecture for the most part. On average, that's not how our brains work. Our brains start to wander off. That's normal. That's normal and human. So, one thing that I try to do when I'm teaching is actively engage the students. I ask them questions. I do things like that. And so you don't have control over that, over what your instructor is doing. And so that's really hard because it's sort of going against your nature to focus on something for a straight hour. I think everything is trainable though, right? Like, so it would probably be about trying to reflect and say, are you first able to notice when you are drifting, right? Training yourself to notice that and be like, nope, I got to bring it back. Or, finding ways, when you're, it's a tricky balance though, because again, you want to be able to pay attention. And so some of the things that will help bring your attention back could pull you away from the material. So I think it's just noticing what you're doing. I was thinking
was like, if you get distracted, like snap a rubber band on your arm.
But then that becomes a distraction.
You can become, it's like, that's your fidget thing and you just sit there and do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's a tricky thing. Again, this really does fall more on your instructors than it does on you, because that's normal and human, right? What I would want them to do is to say, okay, it's been 10, 15 minutes on this topic. I need something. It doesn't need to be a long, it doesn't need to be everybody get up and stretch for 5 minutes, but it's just change up the way I'm teaching. So I lectured for 5 minutes and now we're going to do a think, pair, share. Or, I spoke for 15 minutes. That's enough for that topic. We're going to stop. And what questions do you have? Right. Even just those kinds of pauses to engage you can really help. And it's hard for me to imagine like how you can do that on your own without it in and of itself being a distraction. And so I don't know. I'm like, do you email all your professors? I like, hey, I'm
They
having
have like Menti questions and stuff during the lectures too.
Okay.
And I guess like I'm kind of in the middle, so they do ask questions to students sometimes, but I'm in like the middle back and I'm also terrified of being wrong. So I never answer.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, those kinds of things will help you stay more engaged.
Okay.
So I get the terrified of being wrong, but now's the time to be wrong.
Yeah.
Now is the time to be
Sometimes
wrong.
when you're wrong, you forever learn that because it was so embarrassing.
That's not helping. So one thing I will say, like, okay, think back to the last time you were in class and maybe a classmate of yours answered a question wrong. Did you judge them for it? Were you like, wow, what an idiot?
I don't remember the last time a classmate answered a question that was wrong.
Because they're never wrong, or because you just don't, it's not that important?
I don't know. Probably that it's not that important.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely that in the history of all the time you've been in vet school, not a single person has ever said anything wrong out loud. I think that's unlikely.
Or you have like you were in your lecture and some students said stuff and you're like, oh, well, that's this, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Sometimes, yeah.
So it was the wrong answer, but they frame it differently.
Yeah, exactly. Here's my thing. If you're trying to answer a question in class, that's a form of retrieval practice. Yeah. That's what I want to be doing. And part of me just wants to be like, get over being wrong, because vet med, I'm wrong every day.
You can be right and you're
wrong. Yeah, you can do everything right and it doesn't go well. So it's actually a really good thing to start practicing getting over now. And I really don't think your classmates are going to care because you're not like, oh, yep, that time that, Joan said that thing and we all still talk about it. No, you don't. And also, if you say something, there's probably other people in your class who would have answered the same way. Yeah. And being wrong helps everybody.
That's one thing people say about like our podcast. When I say stuff like, I have no idea about any of this stuff. And I'll say something that's off the wall or like ask a question that should be totally obvious. And he's like, oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because I didn't know.
We do hear that feedback. People are grateful for Topher for asking the things that he didn't know because I didn't think to clarify it. And they're like, no, I had that same question. But also, you were brave enough to come on here and share your experience. Like, just carry that into the classroom, right? Your classmates aren't going to judge you because you didn't know everything. Because if you already knew everything, you wouldn't be in class. You'd have graduated. You'd be practicing by now.
And if they do, there's plenty of other people in Glasgow.
Yeah. Right.
You can go to the non-vet bar.
Well, and like, do you want to be friends with somebody who's going to judge you because you said something wrong out loud in class? Like, are they going to be like, oh, yep, she's an idiot. Not good. Like, then I don't want you as my friend. Like, you're not a very nice person. Yeah.
It's not middle school anymore. Like, there are other people.
So again, I don't want to belabor this and I don't want to like completely play it down. Like it is scary to speak up publicly and to be wrong. Yeah. But I've done it many times and I'm okay.
Yeah. It's a learnable skill.
Yeah, I am okay. And I have people, sometimes I think people respect you more.
It's kind of like if you think about like driving, like when you first drove, you were probably like very nervous and I'm going to hit everything. All these cars are going to come hit me. But now it's just a thing you do.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's skill. It's a skill you can learn. But and I would encourage
very scary driving 70 miles per hour. Another thing, 10 feet away, driving 70 miles per hour at you.
Yeah. Yeah, it probably should be scarier than it is, right? Okay. But yeah, it's not the kind of thing that it should really bother you. And having that growth, like you're here to learn and grow and not to perform in front of anybody else. That's not the goal, right? And so that mindset will just help you. And again, but then like talk to your it sounds like you got a good group of friends in your study group and, chat with them and be like, okay, I'm kind of freaking out, but, like Bobbi said, I should probably, answer more of these questions in class. And like, what do you all think? Are you guys going to like make fun of me if I get them wrong? And they're like, yeah, definitely we're going to make fun of you, but we don't care. We're still going to be friends with you. We're still going to love you and we're still going to study with you because at the end of the day, right, it's the people who know you best. I tell people all the time, like how you do on an exam doesn't define what kind of vet you're going to be. Whether or not you pass boards on the first try doesn't mean you're going to be a good vet. And the flip side, just because you passing it doesn't mean you're going to be good, and not passing it doesn't mean you're bad. It's a test, right? We have to do them. We have to have some way of verifying, like, yeah, you know enough to do this, but it's not the be all and end all.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna say
take those opportunities.
It's the test is a game. So sometimes you just have to like think of game strategy. So if you have one professor who's super engaging and you get everything out of their lecture and they're amazing, but you have another professor who is extremely boring and you don't get much out of it, you need to study more for the boring professor and sacrifice the fun class. Like, oh, I got a lot out of that lecture. I'm not going to focus as much on that material because
that was a study session.
Yeah.
So again, that's prioritizing, and you're figuring that out, right? Like you know that. But yes, if your instructors are giving you opportunities to participate in class and you're finding yourself struggling, not force yourself to engage more. It will help you to not drift off as much. Like if you imagine if you had a professor who could call on anybody in the class at any time. Like that, that might be too much anxiety, right? There are people, but again, yeah, we've all kind of probably experienced it different times. I'm not saying I advocate for that, but if you're thinking, I want to be ready to answer these questions at any time, and volunteer to participate or to ask questions, that is better for your learning and understanding for sure.
Okay. And then, I don't know if you do this, but we have a lot of teachers that give recommended reading, or like there's optional textbooks.
Yeah.
But it's not testable material. Yeah. And like I said, I'm just trying to find more efficient ways to study.
Yeah.
Is it worth it?
No, not unless you're like, I'm struggling to understand this concept. There's a resource that I could turn to that might help us understand it, right? Like if you and your study group are like, we're still not getting this, then look at the suggested readings for extra help.
Or I would not you enjoy.
Yeah, but I wouldn't routinely say every time, because it's just too much. There's so much out there, right?
Yeah, those are the above and beyond things.
That's if you're like cruising and everything's easy and you're like, you're bored. Like, then
maybe save the lists for later.
Yeah, there's probably some really good stuff.
If you have summer off or like you've graduated and you want to go review.
Yeah, but those will all be out of date by then. Anyway, no, it really should be as needed, right? That's how I would treat it. Yeah, for sure. I feel like I feel like this has been good. We've been talking about good stuff. How are you feeling? Has this been helpful for you?
This has been so helpful. It's so hard to find a resource too, because I feel like vet med is so unique in a lot of the ways.
Yeah, well, it's like you're lumped in with grad school PhD people, but
it's very different.
It's like a vocational school where you're like learning to be an electrician.
Yeah.
So it's like, I need to learn everything step by step instead of like, you need to work on your project and get with your PI and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I need to learn a specific thing and be able to do it. Or else an animal will die.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and we're really fortunate enough to have teachers that are veterinarians, but they aren't actually teachers. And so it's definitely, it's worthwhile to like note that they don't have time to write a bunch of like individual weekly quizzes or like things like that. And
a lot of them aren't even trained they have, most of them probably have zero training in education.
Yeah, the majority of them don't. I mean, that's one of the things I've been working on for myself. That's why I'm doing the master's in ed psych, to try to be better and to try to apply these things so that I can help my students. And then I also try to talk about how to study. Like I talk about this at the beginning. This semester is when I have my ECC course. And in the first orientation, day where I talk about stuff, there's no content that I present. But one of the things I talk about is obviously very briefly, but I talk about retrieval practice and like, don't rewrite your notes. Don't just highlight the readings. Don't just rewatch. Yes, you're going to have the lecture capture, but if all you do is rewatch it, that's not going to be the same as if you try to process it and put something yourself out. That's so much more powerful. So it's true. Most of us kind of stumble across different ways that learn for us. And then you get to vet school and you're like, hey, those things that worked in undergrad aren't cutting it anymore because there's so much more material. And so you have to learn how to study.
Going back to high school learning. So after doing all your undergrad stuff where it's like, you have one class and you need to do a few things for it, and it's mostly on your own.
No, it's like, no, you have all the classes every day and
Yeah.
they all expect you to do all the things, and it's a ton. And then, changing, moving to a different country and then changing the system is a, it sounds like you've done pretty darn well. So I'd say good on you for that. Good on you for, again, trying to figure out how to be better. Share this with your group, your study group. And then I hope you'll report back and let us know what's working and how things are going. And if you're noticing any kind of a difference. But thanks so much, Bon, for reaching out. It was really, really fun to talk to you. And thanks for being vulnerable and sharing kind of where you are on the show. I guarantee you this will help other people.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Yes, it was great chatting with you. And we'll catch you all next time.
Bye.